Rain poured over the city like silver threads, each drop clinging to the glass, reflecting the glimmering streetlights. Inside the Vaughn estate, Lena stood silently by the window, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the trails of raindrops running down the cold glass. She was used to this feeling, the isolation, the heavy silence of a house that once overflowed with warmth and laughter. Ever since her mother passed away, everything had become a mere shadow of the past. Her father, James Vaughn, once a lively and devoted man, had slowly drowned in grief and work, his laughter fading into distant memories. And that was when Vivian Rothwell entered their lives. Vivian wasn't just James's new wife. She was the one who controlled everything in the Vaughn household. To outsiders, she was elegance itself, charming, sophisticated, and poised. But behind closed doors, her true nature surfaced. Cold, calculating, every word a carefully crafted dagger wrapped in silk. Lena had learned to read her stepmother's every move, the measured steps, the sharp glances, the subtle yet cutting remarks designed to break her down. Tonight, the sound of heels echoed down the hallway. She knew the storm was coming. The door swung open, revealing Vivian, her smile as sharp as a blade hidden in velvet. "Come downstairs, Lena," she said, her voice smooth as honey, but laced with quiet authority. "There's someone who wants to meet you." Lena turned, keeping her face unreadable. She had no idea what awaited her downstairs, but unease coiled in her stomach, a silent warning that her world was about to change forever. She took a deep breath and stepped out of the room, one step that could alter the course of her life. Lena descended the grand staircase slowly, each step pulling her closer to a fate she hadn't chosen. The soft glow of the chandelier barely illuminated the dark shadows stretching across the vast living room. A deep, authoritative voice cut through the quiet hum of the rain outside. $10 million. That's my offer. An investment in Vaughn Enterprises in exchange for a marriage. Lena froze. Her pulse pounded in her ears. Stepping into the room, she took in the scene before her. James Vaughn, her father, sat in his usual leather armchair, his fingers wrapped tightly around a whiskey glass, his face weary and distant. Beside him stood Vivian Rothwell, her lips curled into a satisfied yet utterly insincere smile. But the man who truly commanded the room was Richard Montgomery. He carried the air of someone who was always in control. His tailored black suit, salt and pepper hair slicked back, and piercing eyes that never wavered. "Marriage?" Lena's voice came out sharp, edged with disbelief. Vivian stepped forward, resting a gentle yet unyielding hand on her shoulder. "Calm yourself, Lena," she cooed, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "This is an incredible opportunity. Marrying Killian Montgomery won't just secure your future, it will save your father's company." Lena jerked her shoulder away, eyes blazing. "Opportunity? This is a transaction," she spat. "You're selling me off like a piece of property." Vivian let out a soft, patronizing laugh. "Selling you? Don't be so dramatic. Do you have any idea how many girls would kill for this chance?" Lena turned to her father, desperation rising in her chest. She needed him to say something, to fight for her. But James Vaughn only lifted his glass and took another long, slow sip. A sharp pang sliced through her chest. Richard Montgomery observed the exchange with an air of quiet amusement, as if he had already anticipated the outcome. "Oh, do we have a deal?" he asked, his gaze fixed on James. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Then, at last, James gave a small nod. Lena's world collapsed beneath her feet. Outside, the rain continued to fall. She had been sold, and no one cared but her. The sky was dull gray the next morning, mirroring Lena's mood. Last night's rain had stopped, but the cold emptiness still clung to her, a quiet warning of what was to come. She sat in Vivian's sleek black car, wearing a plain white dress her stepmother had chosen. "Nothing too extravagant," Vivian had said when she handed it to her that morning. "Something appropriate for a girl in your situation." Lena hated the dress. It wasn't a wedding gown. It felt more like a uniform for someone being sent to prison. The car pulled up outside an old courthouse. There was no church, no flowers, no music. Nothing about this resembled a wedding. It was just a deal being finalized in silence. She stepped inside, where a weary-looking judge waited. Her father sat beside Vivian, who looked pleased as ever. On the other side of the room stood Killian Montgomery. Lena had never seen him before, and he wasn't what she expected. He didn't look cruel or arrogant, like a man willing to buy a wife with money. Killian was tall, his gray eyes sharp but not filled with contempt. As she approached, he studied her for a long moment before speaking, his voice low and firm. "I know you don't want this, but I promise you one thing. I won't make it worse than it has to be." Lena didn't know how to respond. She had expected a monster, a man like his father. Instead, she found someone different. The judge began reciting the vows. Everything happened too fast, as if someone had pressed fast forward on her life without her consent. "Miss Lena Vaughn, do you take Killian Montgomery as your lawfully wedded husband?" Her throat closed up. She wanted to say no, to scream, to run, but Vivian's gaze was razor sharp, watching her like a predator. Her father sat still, his hands trembling, unable to meet her eyes. No one was going to save her from this. "I do?" The words barely left her lips, carrying the weight of a girl forced into a marriage she never wanted. The wedding band slid onto her finger, cold, foreign. The judge declared them husband and wife. There was no celebration, no applause. Killian leaned in slightly, his voice just above a whisper. "I'm not the husband you expected, but I also won't be the man you fear." Lena looked at him but said nothing, because right now she wasn't sure what was more terrifying, him or the marriage itself. Lena sat in silence as the luxury car glided through the streets of New York, carrying her toward an unfamiliar world. Towering skyscrapers gleamed under the sun, reflecting a life that seemed beautiful yet unreachable, just like her own now. The sleek black Bentley turned down a private road, passing through the massive wrought iron gates of the Montgomery estate. The building ahead wasn't just a mansion, it was a palace, a masterpiece of stone and glass, its towering windows and manicured gardens screaming of wealth and power. But to Lena, it wasn't a home, it was a gilded cage. When the car stopped, Killian opened the door, offering his hand. She stared at it for a moment before stepping out without accepting his help. He didn't react. He simply turned and led the way inside. Lena nearly lost her breath at the opulence surrounding her. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceilings, their lights reflecting off polished marble floors. Gilded frames held paintings so old they looked like they belonged in a museum. A kind-looking older woman approached with a warm smile. "Welcome to the Montgomery estate, ma'am," she said gently. "I'm Mrs. Collins, the housekeeper. If you need anything, just let me know." She seemed nice, but it didn't change the fact that this wasn't home. Killian led her down a long corridor before stopping at a set of ornately carved double doors. "This is your room," he said, his voice neutral. "You have complete privacy here. No one enters unless you allow it." Lena blinked in surprise. She had expected control, restrictions, but instead he was giving her space? Slowly, she pushed the door open. The room was massive, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a garden full of roses. A grand bed with soft ivory sheets sat in the center, flanked by elegant furniture and a wall of bookshelves. On the polished wooden vanity, there was a note and a key. She picked up the note, her fingers tracing the bold yet refined handwriting. "This is your home. Make it your own." Lena set the card down slowly. She had no idea what awaited her in this new life. But at least in this gilded cage, she had been given a space to breathe. The first few days at the Montgomery estate passed in an unsettling silence. Killian kept his promise. He didn't control Lena, nor did he interfere with her life. But that didn't mean she could forget everything. Vivian had sold her. A quiet rage simmered inside her every time she remembered her stepmother's satisfied smirk, the cold indifference in her father's eyes. But fate, it seemed, had its own plans. One afternoon, as Lena was reading in her room, there was a knock on the door. "You have a visitor," Mrs. Collins said gently. "It's your father." Lena froze. The housekeeper hesitated as if she wanted to say more, but simply gave a soft smile before stepping away. When Lena reached the living room, she could hardly believe her eyes. James Vaughn sat there, looking more broken than she had ever seen him. His hair had grayed significantly, deep lines etched across his face, and his once proud shoulders slumped under an invisible weight. But Vivian was nowhere in sight. "Hey, are you here?" Lena's voice was cold. "Did you come to check if I've adjusted to my new life?" James met his daughter's gaze, regret written all over his face. "Vivian has been arrested," he said quietly. Lena needed a moment to process the words. "Arrested?" she echoed, disbelief lacing her tone. James nodded, his hands trembling slightly as he held his untouched glass of water. "After you left, everything started to unravel. The police launched an investigation into Vaughn Enterprises and found that Vivian had been embezzling millions for years. She was using company money to fund her extravagant lifestyle." Something strange stirred inside Lena. Not joy, not satisfaction, just relief. "And you?" she asked. James let out a bitter chuckle. "I let her control everything for too long. Now I have nothing, Lena." She looked at the man before her, the father she had once loved, once trusted. Now he was just a shell of the man he used to be. And perhaps he had realized it far too late. After meeting her father, Lena felt empty. She had once imagined the day Vivian would finally pay for what she had done, but now that it had happened, the satisfaction she expected never came. Instead, there was only exhaustion. That night, as she sat alone by the massive window in her room, a deep voice broke the silence behind her. "Are you okay?" Lena turned. Killian stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. He rarely initiated conversations with her, so the fact that he was doing so now caught her off guard. "I don't know," she admitted. Killian nodded, as if he understood that feeling better than she did. He stepped forward, pulling a chair closer to her. "Do you want to talk about it?" Lena hesitated. She didn't think he actually cared. They were just two strangers, bound by a marriage neither of them had wanted. But then she realized something. He had never treated her like property. Even though their marriage wasn't built on love, Killian had never forced anything upon her. So for the first time, she decided to trust him. "Vivian was arrested," she said quietly. "She had been embezzling money from my father's company for years." Killian didn't look surprised. "I figured that would happen." Lena turned to him. "You knew?" He shrugged. "Not the details, but I know people like her. They always destroy themselves in the end." A long silence stretched between them, but it wasn't tense like before. "I don't know how I'm supposed to feel," Lena sighed. "You don't have to decide right now," Killian said, his voice calm but surprisingly gentle. "Emotions aren't always as simple as we want them to be." Lena studied him a little longer. She had once thought she would hate this man, but now he didn't seem like a stranger anymore. Maybe this marriage wasn't a prison after all. Maybe it was something else, a beginning she had never expected. In the weeks that followed, the relationship between Lena and Killian began to shift in subtle ways. He was no longer just the stranger she had been forced to marry. He became a part of her life in ways she never expected. At first, it was small things. Killian kept his distance, gave her space, but sometimes he appeared just when she needed someone. One afternoon, Lena took a walk through the estate's garden. The air was calm, the roses in full bloom, but inside, her thoughts were anything but peaceful. She had lost so much: her family, her freedom, the carefree innocence of youth. "You seem to like this garden," a voice came from behind her. Lena turned to see Killian leaning against the glass doorway, a cup of coffee in his hand. "I like the quiet," she admitted. "At least, it doesn't try to control me." Killian nodded, then suddenly asked, "Have you ever thought about leaving?" The question made Lena freeze. Of course she had thought about it. But leaving? And then what? She had no money, no place to go. Her whole world had been controlled for so long that she no longer knew what she actually wanted. "I don't know," she admitted. "Can you give me an answer?" Killian was quiet for a moment before sighing. "I don't think you're the kind of person who lets others decide her life for her." Lena was caught off guard by that statement. No one had ever spoken about her that way before. All her life she had been told what to do, who to be, but for the first time someone was telling her she could choose her own fate. For the first time, Killian wasn't just a husband on paper. He was someone who made her see herself differently. Lena never thought her heart could change. She had entered this marriage with fear and resentment, believing Killian was just like every other man in her life, a person who wanted to control and own her. But he wasn't like that. The change didn't come from some grand moment. It came from the little things. The quiet evenings when Killian sat with her on the balcony, both of them silently watching the city lights. The way he noticed how she liked her coffee and made sure it was prepared exactly right every morning. And most of all, he never forced anything on her. One evening, after dinner on the rooftop, Lena absent-mindedly reached for a napkin. At the same time, Killian moved his hand forward, and their fingers brushed against each other. She felt the warmth of his touch. It was just a fleeting second, but in that second, she realized everything had changed. Lena quickly pulled her hand back, her heartbeat louder than it should be. She looked up and met Killian's gaze. It wasn't cold, it wasn't distant. It was soft, gentle, and something else she had never seen before. Lena started to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Killian only gave a small smile, as if he understood exactly what she was feeling. "It's okay," he said quietly. "Take your time." She nodded, but as she turned away, she knew it was already too late to turn back. Something had begun between them, and it couldn't be ignored anymore. After that moment, Lena knew everything between her and Killian had changed. Neither of them mentioned the way their fingers had touched that night, but it lingered, unspoken yet undeniable. They became more comfortable in the silence. Killian was no longer a stranger she feared, and Lena was no longer just a girl trapped in an unwanted marriage. They were becoming something else. One night, when Lena couldn't sleep, she went down to the kitchen for a glass of water. She didn't expect to see Killian there, sitting at the counter with a glass of whiskey in his hand. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice low and warm in the quiet room. Lena nodded, then glanced at him. "And you?" Killian swirled the amber liquid in his glass, the dim light casting shadows across his sharp features, revealing a tiredness she hadn't noticed before. "Neither can I." Lena didn't know why she spoke, but the words slipped out anyway. "Do you ever feel lost?" Killian held her gaze for a long moment before answering quietly. "Everyone does, at some point." Neither of them said anything more, but there was an understanding in their silence. They were two people thrown into a life they hadn't chosen, but now they were learning how to find their own way. And maybe they wouldn't have to do it alone anymore. The storm that night came without warning. Winds howled against the windows, branches scraped against the glass like they were trying to break the silence of the Montgomery estate. Lena jerked awake, her heart pounding in her chest. She hated storms. As a child, whenever there was thunder, her mother would hold her close, soothing her with soft stories. But now her mother was gone, and this massive room only made her feel more alone than ever. A loud crash of thunder shook the walls. Before she could think, she was out of bed, walking down the dimly lit hallway. She wasn't sure where she was going. Her feet simply moved on instinct. It wasn't until she found herself standing in front of Killian's door that she hesitated. But before she could turn away, the door opened. Killian stood there, his shirt unbuttoned at the top, his sharp eyes scanning her face before settling on the lingering fear in her expression. "Are you okay?" His voice was low, softer than usual. Lena didn't know how to answer. She wasn't okay, but she didn't want to admit it either. Killian studied her for a moment, then silently stepped aside, an unspoken invitation. Lena walked in. His room felt warmer than hers. She let out a slow breath as she sank into a chair by the window, listening to the heavy rain pounding against the glass. Killian said nothing, simply poured her a cup of tea from the pot on the table and set it in her hands. A small, quiet gesture, but full of understanding. "Thank you," she murmured. Killian sat across from her, his gaze steady, as if trying to read the thoughts she couldn't bring herself to say. "I used to hate you," Lena admitted suddenly. "I thought you were just another man trying to control my life." Killian tilted his head slightly. And now? She held his gaze for a long moment, then exhaled softly. Now, I'm not so sure. Something shifted in Killian's expression, a flicker of warmth mixed with something more careful. Slowly, he reached up and brushed a loose strand of hair from her cheek. She stopped breathing. They were standing on a fragile boundary, one that, if crossed, would change everything forever. But when Killian finally spoke, his voice was calm and certain. "Lena, I won't do anything you don't want." She didn't know why, but those words made her chest tighten. Not from fear, but from a kind of safety she had never known before. She nodded. And that night, in a room warmer than the raging storm outside, they sat together in silence. No pressure, no expectations, just the quiet presence of one another. And perhaps that was the beginning of something far deeper. After that stormy night, everything between Lena and Killian changed. They didn't talk about it. No one mentioned how Lena had sought him out in the middle of the storm, but the silence between them wasn't the same anymore. Now, when Killian walked into a room, Lena no longer tensed. When their hands brushed accidentally, she didn't pull away so quickly. Her feelings toward him had shifted, in a way she wasn't ready to admit. One morning, as Lena sat reading in the library, Killian walked in, holding 2 cups of coffee. He set one in front of her. "Just the way you like it," he said simply. Lena looked at him, then at the coffee. It was such a small thing, but somehow it warmed her more than the drink itself. "Thank you," she murmured. Killian sat down beside her, opening his own book. They didn't speak, but in that silence, something had shifted. Something familiar. Something more than an obligation. Something neither of them was ready to name. Lena never thought she would have a choice. Her life had always been dictated by others, her father, her stepmother, and now this forced marriage to Killian. But for the first time, she started to wonder, if she could truly choose, what would she want? One afternoon, as Lena stood on the balcony gazing at the endless sky, Killian stepped beside her. They stood there, silent, but no longer distant. "Have you ever thought about the future?" Killian asked, his voice deep and steady. Lena turned to him. The future was never mine to think about. Killian nodded, as if he had expected that answer. He looked at her then, his gaze serious but never demanding. "If you could choose, what would you do?" She didn't have an answer right away. But as she met Killian's eyes, for the first time in her life, she realized she actually had a choice. And maybe that choice had never been clearer. Lena was never the type to act on impulse. Her whole life had been controlled, dictated, and she had learned to be cautious with every decision she made. But with Killian, everything was different. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace, Lena looked at Killian in a way she never had before. He was no longer just the man she had been forced to marry. He was the one who quietly placed a cup of coffee exactly the way she liked it every morning. The one who listened even when she didn't know how to put her thoughts into words. The one who saw her, not as an obligation, but as a person. She set her tea down, taking a deep breath. "I want to try." Killian's brow furrowed slightly, his eyes searching hers. "Try what?" She swallowed, her heart pounding harder than ever. "Try trusting you." The air between them became impossibly still. Killian didn't smile, didn't tease, he just looked at her for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether she truly meant it. Then slowly he held out his hand. Lena stared at it, hesitation flickering in her gaze. But then she placed her hand in his. The warmth of his palm spread through her, but it wasn't just warmth, it was safety, certainty. Lena met his gaze, her eyes filled with something unspoken. Killian held her stare, and this time there was no restraint left. Neither knew who leaned in first, but in the next moment, their lips met. The kiss was hesitant at first, slow and searching, as if they were still testing this new boundary. But then, Killian couldn't hold back anymore. He pulled her closer, his hands cradling her face, deepening the kiss, claiming it. Lena didn't pull away. Instead, she melted into him, surrendering to the moment. From that second on, there was no turning back. Killian lifted Lena into his arms, carrying her to his bedroom, his movements steady, certain, like he had known all along that this was where they were meant to be. When they reached the bed, he paused, searching her eyes for permission one last time. But Lena didn't answer with words. Instead, she slowly unbuttoned his shirt, and Killian knew she had made her choice. That night, they came together, not just in passion, but in trust, in acceptance, in something neither of them had dared to name before. As dawn approached, Lena lay against Killian's chest, their breaths rising and falling as one. And she knew this wasn't just any night. It was the first leap into a love she had never believed she could have. 1 year later, Lena stood on the balcony of the Montgomery estate, watching the golden hues of the sunset bathe the vast gardens below. Everything had changed. She was no longer the girl forced into this marriage. She had chosen to stay, chosen to love Killian, chosen a life she never thought she could have. Her hand rested gently on her stomach, where a tiny life was growing. "What are you thinking about?" Killian's deep, familiar voice broke the silence as he stepped behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, his chin resting lightly on her shoulder. Lena smiled, leaning into his warmth, the place that now truly felt like home. "I'm thinking about everything," she whispered. "About us, about how it all began, and about our baby." Killian chuckled softly, his hand covering hers, feeling the warmth of their growing child. "If someone had told me a year ago that I would fall in love with the woman I married in a business deal, I wouldn't have believed them." Lena turned to face him, her fingers tracing the face she had come to love more than anything in the world. "And if someone had told me that one day I'd choose to stay because of love, I wouldn't have believed them either." Killian tilted his head down, kissing her, slow and deep the way he always did. With reverence, with devotion. The evening breeze whispered around them, but their hearts had never felt warmer. Their story hadn't begun as a love story, but they had made it one of the most beautiful stories they could write together. Because love isn't something that's predetermined, it's something we choose every single day. And Lena had chosen Killian, just as Killian had chosen her, forever.